What's up, everybody? I am now live with Professor Grover Furr from Montclair State University, and today we're going to be talking about the lies that were told about Stalin. So, Professor Furr, if you'd like to give a brief introduction in case there's people who aren't familiar with your work, or...
Well, certainly. I'll be brief. For about the last 20 years or so, I've been making my main research job, the investigation of and study of the documents from former Soviet archives that have gradually been released in Russia after the end of the Soviet Union. And the first book I published is titled Khrushchev Lied, and that's about the famous speech, secret speech, as it's called in English, and that Khrushchev gave to the 20th Party Congress in 1956, attacking Joseph Stalin. And in that book, with the help of documents from the former Soviet archives, I was able to prove that basically Khrushchev didn't make even a single accusation that was true. We can disprove virtually everything he said, or all the accusations that he made against Stalin and Beria in that speech. Since then, I've gone on to investigate other alleged crimes by Stalin, and I've written a total of about 14 books on the subjects of Soviet history during the Stalin period. And what I've found so far is that I can't verify a single crime that Stalin committed. And all of the allegations of crimes that you hear or read about Stalin, it turns out are false. So I'm continuing that research. It's very striking. It's very surprising to many people. I myself am not surprised anymore. I certainly was surprised at the beginning of this research journey. And I hope that your audience is interested in this subject too.
Yes, they most definitely are. Myself included. One of the reasons why we consider the question of Stalin's legacy of such importance today, and even practical importance, is that, currently there's been a revival within the... We don't have to get into any politics, but there's currently been somewhat of a revival of the Communist Party in the United States. So now we're trying to grapple with the questions of the 20th century, which, the Communist Party is struggling with now. The Soviet Union is gone, and now it's grappling and struggling with questions about its own history and the history of the world communist movement at large.
Yes.
And that actually brings me to my first question. I think the beginning of one of the biggest shifts in the history of world communism was Khrushchev's secret speech. And that secret speech had these far-reaching implications where suddenly the communist parties the world over, they underwent several splits. There was a big factor in the Sino-Soviet split. So Khrushchev's secret speech, must have been pretty damning, right? And my question for you is, what are the most illustrative examples of the way in which, in your view, Khrushchev had lied about Stalin and had lied about the history of the Soviet Union? What were these? What were the most egregious examples of his lies in your view?
Well, actually, there are a lot of them. Khrushchev attacked Stalin at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956 when he gave that famous speech. But he continued to do this, and at the 22nd Party Congress, which was in October 1961, not only Khrushchev, but others, members of the Central Committee, attacked Stalin very, very sharply. And Stalin's body was removed from the Lenin-Stalin mausoleum, for example, as a result of that Congress. And then from 1962 till Khrushchev was deposed in October 1964, Khrushchev sponsored a very large number of books and articles attacking Stalin and the Stalin supporters, particularly during the 1930s, but also during the 1940s. So there was a kind of avalanche of accusations published in the Soviet press, all attacking Stalin. And this continued for some months after Khrushchev was deposed, but it was fairly quickly shut down for a time. After a year or so. it's hard to pick out any one or two representative accusations, but Khrushchev described almost everything that Stalin did in the most negative terms. And then particularly after 1961, after the 22nd Party Congress, writers, historians, journalists attacked many more things, made many more accusations that Stalin, of crimes that they charged against Stalin. And these are still repeated today. That is to say, mainstream historians, mainstream anti-communist historians, and of course Trotskyist historians, have never admitted that Khrushchev lied. They simply ignore that and continue to repeat the same lies about Stalin as were cooked up during Khrushchev's time. And you're right, this caused a tremendous split in the world communist movement. It had, of course, it invigorated, it overjoyed the capitalists and imperialists around the world. It gave a big shot in the arm to the Trotskyist movement because, Trotsky had been saying some of the same kinds of things about Stalin that Khrushchev and his followers said. And we can look back now and see it was perhaps the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, because it's pretty clear that after Leonid Brezhnev died in 1962, and then you had 1982, and then you had Chernenko and Andropov as leaders of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and they didn't really last very long. Once you got to Mikhail Gorbachev, it's obvious that Gorbachev, who was sort of that Khrushchev generation, believed Khrushchev. I'm not saying that Gorbachev and his men were incapable of lying as well, but they believed it. They believed that Khrushchev said. So the notion that Khrushchev actually could have not only lied like a little bit, but really lied all the time about Stalin, requires a complete revision of the way we look at Soviet history and, as a result, world history, because the 20th century in some ways really was the Soviet century. Everything after the Bolshevik Revolution, everything in the world had some sort of relationship or took some sort of position towards the Bolshevik Revolution. It was the major event by far of the 20th century. So Khrushchev's lies are very significant.
What would you say is an example of some of the things Khrushchev had alleged against Stalin?
Sure. I guess people don't read his secret speech very much. But Khrushchev said that Stalin framed, falsely accused, and then had executed leaders of the Bolshevik Party, some prominent members of the Bolshevik Party, the same kind of accusations that Trotsky had made, that he had wrongly killed the military leaders, Marshal Tukhachevsky, and some of the military commanders who were tried and then executed, along with Marshal Tukhachevsky, that he had wrongfully executed many members of the Central Committee, and so forth and so on. I mean, this kind of list of people whom Stalin had wrongly repressed or wrongly had executed and so forth goes on in Khrushchev's speech and then in the writings that he sponsored. So it's hard to pick out just one, but maybe we can get to some of these other questions that you had.
Sure.
But the fact that Khrushchev's secret speech, which was such an earth-shaking event in 20th century history, is based on lies. That the importance of that fact can't be underestimated. I should say can't be overestimated. Should not be underestimated. It really changes almost everything in the way we look at the history of the 20th century.
Well, for Khrushchev to have lied this egregiously really speaks to some kind of internal conflict or antagonism within the Soviet state.
Yes.
So in your view, why did Khrushchev and the rest effectively usurp the Soviet state and lie so egregiously about Stalin in the way that they did? Sure. What interests do you think they represented, and what changes do you think were being planned by Stalin for the Soviet state that maybe would have come at the expense of theirs?
Yes, well, back in 2005, I published a two-part article called Stalin, the Struggle for Democratic Reform. And that was not based really on independent research of mine. It was really a question of making available to an English-reading public some research that had been done by a Russian historian and one or two American historians as well. So it seems pretty clear that Stalin wanted to get the party out of the business of directly running the Soviet Union. He wanted to return power to the Soviets. He also wanted to have secret contested elections to the Soviet. Soviet, of course, means council. So these are the legislative bodies in the Soviet constitution of that time. He wanted to have, elections that were very, very similar to those in Western capitalist countries, with the exception that he didn't want to have different parties. He wanted to have public organizations nominate candidates, but he didn't want to have different parties run. And if you read the 1936 Constitution, it's pretty clear that that was what he wanted to do. In my two-part article of 2005, Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform, which you can get on my webpage, you can download it, and also in a book that I wrote a few years ago called Yezhov versus Stalin, about the so-called Great Purges, Great Terror. I set forth the evidence that it appears that the Central Committee of the party, major party leaders around the country, did not want to do that. They didn't want to have these kinds of democratic elections. There were a couple of other things, too. There were other sort of reforms that Stalin was proposing, in addition to getting the party out of directly running the country, turning that over to the Soviet government, and having the party concentrate, it seems, on winning people to Marxism-Leninism, winning people to communist ideology. Some other issues were that he stated in 1937, and this is actually not secret, it was published at the time. Stalin proposed training courses, training schools in Marxism-Leninism that all party leaders on every level should attend, from the lowest levels of the party all the way up to the provincial oblast levels of central committee. And he laid it out like in very straightforward language that this is what was going to happen. We're going to have these courses, and these party leaders should nominate people to take their place for a while the party leaders themselves went off and took these courses to improve their understanding of Marxism. But clearly, Stalin was concerned about the question of political illiteracy, if you want to put it that way, of the leaders of the party. Those schools never happened, and Stalin announced that they were going to happen, but they never did happen. We never heard any more about them after Stalin made that announcement. One thing it would be good to see, if they are ever forthcoming from the former Soviet archives, is what sort of discussions there were. There might have been something that led to the result that these schools did not exist. It never took place. It's logical to think that the party leaders, or many party leaders, would not have wanted to appoint replacements and go off to ideological training. Perhaps they thought that their replacements would stay in place and they would lose their positions, they would lose their power. And maybe even that it may even be the case that that's what Stalin had in mind. But that's not what he said. And this happens at the same time as the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course is being written, edited, re-edited. Chapters are being sent all over the country for public commentary and suggestions. And this book becomes a kind of primer, kind of a beginning course, if you want, on the history of the Bolshevik Party and also on Marxism-Leninism. So Stalin was very concerned about political literacy, and his efforts did not seem to bear much fruit in the 1930s. When it comes to the late 1940s, Stalin also, is after the war, spurred the creation of a large book on political economy. And spent a lot of time and a lot of resources putting this book together. And this was to be a book on political economy, on historical economy as well. And it eventually was published after Stalin's death, and then, of course, altered under Khrushchev and others later on. But he told one of the major collaborators in this work, if we don't have this book in the hands of tens of thousands of people to be studied, there isn't going to be any communism. That is to say, Stalin clearly believed that the level of political literacy among the party, within the Bolshevik Party, and particularly among the leaders of the party, was low. also, I mean, there were other factors too, but let's just stop there for a time.
I see.
Yeah, I know this doesn't seem to fully explain the hostility towards Stalin that emerged after Khrushchev's secret speech, and particularly after the 22nd Party Congress. So there's probably more to it, and there's probably a lot we still don't understand.
It's interesting because it's pretty ironic compared to the traditional kind of depiction of Stalin in the West as this authoritarian, strong man who, represented, some kind of whimsical, tyrannical power. It seems like Stalin was fighting these mini tyrants at the level of the Soviet bureaucracy, was doing the best he could to defer power back to the Soviet people. So it's
yeah. I'm sorry, you were going to ask a question, or
yeah.
Go ahead.
So the secret speech had really big implications for communist politics in the West.
Yes.
The revelation that they're falsifications, I think, in my view, should have equally sweeping consequences. So in your perspective, do you think the denunciation of Stalin in international communist politics might have something to do with the decline of communist parties in the West?
Well, certainly did, but I would have to say it did, and also there was more to it than that. Certainly, it had a tremendously demoralizing effect on communists all over and in every communist party. I have seen figures, by bourgeois scholars, but it doesn't mean that they're all wrong, that perhaps a third of all of the communists in the world outside of China and outside of the Soviet bloc in China, quit their communist parties within a couple of years of Khrushchev's secret speech. That had a tremendously demoralizing effect. It, of course, gave a big shot in the arm to the anti-communists, not only in the West, but inside the Soviet Union, too. There were lots of people who had never really been won over to the ideals of socialism and worker dictatorship and communism, and who admired Western capitalism for various reasons. Its wealth, its higher standard of living, at least for intellectual elites and others, its level of consumer goods, which did not exist in the Soviet. So sure, it was a major demoralizing factor. And another aspect of that was that the Soviet leadership, at least insofar as we can tell, during Khrushchev's time, but especially after Khrushchev's time, appeared to have believed all of these lies about the Stalin period came out during Khrushchev's time. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect of your question is, does it adequately account for the end of socialism, the downfall of the Soviet Union? And I don't think it adequately accounts for that. I think that we have to keep in mind that Khrushchev himself came from something. Khrushchev was a major party leader, and after 1938, a member of the Politburo during Stalin's time. And the audience in 1956 at 20th Party Congress that heard Khrushchev's speech must have known, many or most of those delegates must have known that much of what Khrushchev said was false because they had lived through that period. But they didn't say it, or they didn't say much. So we really don't know. Of course, it's far too late to go back and ask those delegates. They're all dead. That wasn't done. And there has been relatively little attempt on the part of Russian historians, let's say, to go and investigate the personal papers, the archives of those people who were around at that time. There's a little bit here and there, but not really very much. So I think we still have to discover important causes of the decline of socialism in the Soviet Union and its ultimate collapse. And Khrushchev was a cause, but he was also a symptom of some deeper processes that were.
So speaking of the Soviet archives, since you mentioned them, they've also played a big source of attempts to discredit the Soviet state during the Stalin era and Stalin himself. Do you think that there's the common ways in which the archival evidence has been distorted? Is there?
Well, attacks against Stalin tend to focus on a small number of alleged crimes. It's true that if you read a large number of scholarly studies of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period, you could come up with a large number of alleged crimes. But most communist or Trotskyist criticism of Stalin focuses on a small number of pretty well-known allegations and crimes. In my experience doing research in the Soviet Union during the Stalin period, I have found that the archival evidence tends to disprove the accusations made against Stalin. As a secondary but not unimportant issue, fake documents have also been smuggled into some Soviet archive in order to provide evidence, or to appear to provide evidence to support some of the allegations against Stalin. I think that's a secondary issue, but it's not unimportant because it has big ramifications in certain issues, like, for example, the Katyn massacre. But I'd say the invigorating, the inspiring thing about the documents from the former Soviet archives is they tend to give a very different portrayal of Stalin and of the Soviet Union during the 1930s than the anti-communists and Khrushchev, Trotskyists portray.
Yes, speaking of Katyn, the Katyn massacre is widely used as an example to demonstrate, the criminality of the Soviet state.
Yes.
What are some of the reasons why the narrative of Soviet responsibility gained widespread traction? And
Sure.
In your view, what is the veracity of the claim of Soviet responsibility?
Right. Well, I've written 2 books on the Katyn massacre, a shorter book first and a longer study second, in which I looked at all the evidence. I mean, people talk about the Katyn massacre at least 99 times out of 100. They have not looked at the evidence. That's in part because it's not all that easy to get. It's in part because there are large volumes of documents which purport to be evidence, which claim to be evidence. The Polish government throws all kinds of documents, volumes at you. You talk about Katyn, but actually almost none of those documents bear directly on the question of who shot the Poles, right? They're all kinds of contextual and background information about all kinds of things. So years ago, I realized that sooner or later I was going to have to come to grips with the Katyn issue. And because it is the best documented crime of Stalin, okay? There are lots of other alleged crimes of Stalin, but this is the best one that's best documented. And it originated with the Nazis, and the Nazis collaborated with the Polish government in exile in England, probably behind Churchill's back, but that's not all that important. If it had just been the Nazis who issued the report claiming that the Soviets had killed all these Polish officers, I doubt many people would have accepted it. But the Polish government in exile sent some people at the Nazis' invitation, the Germans' invitation, to go there and prowl around and look at the stuff, look at the evidence, look at the bodies, as though looking at a body can tell you anything, and agreed with the Germans. They said, oh, yes, we hate the Germans, they're ravaging Poland and killing lots of Poles, but they're right about this. They're right about this. Well, of course, the Polish government in exile and the Nazis had a common enemy, and that was the Soviet Union. It's not too surprising that they joined forces here. But I think, and then, of course, after the Cold War began, then the United States and the other so-called allies flipped from accepting the Soviet version to now accepting the Nazi version, but they don't call it the Nazi version. They call it the Polish government in exile version. And it became clear to me from studying this and from going back to the primary sources, which very few people have done, it's clear that the Gorbachev and the Gorbachev leadership of the Soviet Union in the 1980s accepted Soviet guilt. They believed that Stalin and Beria, the others, had the Poles shot. So when they told the Poles, that the Polish government, that yes, Stalin had all these people shot, all these prisoners of war shot, I'm convinced they believed it. There's some evidence that suggests very strongly that they believed it themselves. But of course, the Katyn is a bonanza for anti-communists, anti-Stalinists, anti-Soviets, a bonanza for Gorbachev. It continues to be, and so, to such an extent that it is literally taboo. It is literally forbidden in the mainstream scholarship to question Soviet guilt at Katyn, regardless of the evidence. And I've had some personal experience with that after having written my book. So it's been very successful. The story of the false story of Soviet guilt at Katyn has played an important role in, let's say, depicting the Stalin regime as similar in essence, if not in quantity, to the Nazi mass murders. And that's kind of the way in which it's employed in the effort to equate or to almost equate communism with Nazism, the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, and Stalin. That's the overarching term that's invented and employed to do that is totalitarian. So, the totalitarians are allegedly the Nazis and the communists, Stalin and Hitler. That's a major thrust of Western and Trotskyist, anti-communist and Trotskyist propaganda against Stalin and the Soviet Union. But they believe it too. I mean, it's not like they know it isn't true, but they say it anyway. There's lots of that going on, but not about Katyn. They believe it.
And of course, not to dwell too much, but there's also supposed archival evidence to support, they allege, the Katyn massacre.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, that's a really interesting story, and I don't want to go on about it too long. But Gorbachev, allegedly in 1991, just before the end of the Soviet Union, handed over to Boris Yeltsin, who was to become the first president of Russia, a packet of documents called, in English, closed packet number 1. From the Politburo archives, supposedly, that contained the orders and the various evidence that the Soviets were guilty. And then Yeltsin, a year or so later, handed this off to Lech Walesa, who was the president of Poland, and this stuff was all published. Well, in the year, not everybody accepted this, not everybody believed it, but I would say most people. I had no reason not to believe it, but some things about it didn't seem quite kosher. Nevertheless, in 2010, a member of the Russian Duma is the parliament or the House of Representatives, if you want, right, of the Russian government. A member of the Russian Duma named Viktor Ilyushin, he was a member of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. It was a very large party in Russia. Presented to the Duma publicly draft forgery documents that he said that he had received from a man who had been hired to forge these documents that Gorbachev gave to Yeltsin, and Yeltsin gave to Walesa, that were published to prove Soviet guilt. And that's pretty important stuff. And so important that it was completely hushed up. I have never found a single article in Western newspapers, for example, it even mentions it. And as far as I know, in my study of the Katyn issue, only one Russian newspaper, outside of the Communist Party news, of course, but only one Russian newspaper mentioned it. That is general purpose, general news source. It was almost completely hushed up. Fortunately, we have the internet, and it was publicized on the internet. So that's pretty important, and I think it's just as important to recognize that it's been suppressed. That even people who claim to know about the Katyn issue very often are unaware or have not studied this material. So that was an example of smuggling phony documents into the archives. There are some web pages which describe all of this. I listed.
Yeah, additionally, and related, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is also an example that they use to demonstrate, Soviet criminal intent.
Sure.
And additionally, the accusation is made on top of that as a consequence of that pact, that Stalin had turned over German communists back to the Nazis. So what is the basis of allegations like these? And what's
Well, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is an interesting issue. I I wrote an article which I just put on my webpage about. I think that was also in 2009 or 2010, and it's still there. But there are a few mainstream Soviet scholars who write good stuff about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, about the Soviet effort to forge collective security with France and Great Britain, and the fact that France and Great Britain refused to do that, refused to join with the Soviets in any kind of treaty to keep Hitler at bay. So it's not quite like the Katyn massacre, for example. I mean, no mainstream scholar of the Soviet Union, no matter how liberal or how much on the margins of respectability they may be, are going to say, are going to admit that there's doubt that the Soviets were guilty at Katyn, even though they weren't, but because that puts you beyond the pale. Nobody will speak to you. They'll invite you to conferences and publish your papers and stuff. But when it comes to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, there are a couple of scholars who have written stuff on it, and they have not been confined to the ninth circle of hell. They haven't been drummed out of the profession for that. It's very clear. The evidence is very, very clear. One of those authors is Geoffrey Roberts, a former professor in Ireland of Soviet history. Now I think he's retired. Another is Michael J. Carley. He was at the University of Montreal, Canada, and there are some Russian scholars too. So I think that is not that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has gotten some good, reliable scholarship to expose how it was. By the way, in December 2020, might have been 2019, December 2019, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, gave a talk about the Soviet Union and the beginnings of World War II. It was spurred on by the fact that the Soviet Union had not been invited to a commemoration, some sort of commemorative ceremony in Poland. Russia hadn't invited. And the Polish nationalist right-wing version is, we were never liberated, the Soviets, you can't say the Soviets liberated Poland. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. The Polish Jewish organizations say that's wrong. Polish Jews were absolutely liberated from Hitler by the Red Army. But the Polish government won't say that because they're so anti-communist. Communists can't liberate people, only capitalists can do that. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was essential and necessary, and Putin gave a very good speech, a very accurate speech in December 2019, where he cited, obviously he hadn't done the research, he'd had historians do the research, he cited all of the documents. And you have to ignore these documents in order to think that the Soviets did anything wrong at all in signing the Molotov. And by the way, just to finish up on the pact, the official version of history is the Soviet Union invaded Poland on September the 17th, 1939, in some sort of concert with the Germans who had invaded on September the 1st. But that's not true. I have an article on my webpage, one I referred to before, which is titled something like, did the Soviet Union invade Poland in 1939? The answer is no, they didn't. The Polish government fled the country without appointing a government in exile. And under international law, this means that the Polish state has ceased to exist. In addition, the area of Poland that the Soviet Union occupied and kept, that is Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, had been taken by Poland from Soviet Russia in 1921, taken by military action and conquer. And the Polish government had terribly mistreated the Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish populations of these areas. And after the war, the Polish nationalists had an underground terrorist campaign to try to get these territories back for Poland, which of course was unsuccessful. And the contemporary Polish government has given up, no longer claims these territories as part of Poland. So it's a tacit agreement that these territories were never of Poland. I mean, there's a right-wing Polish saying, we should take it back. Poland should have the same borders that it had in the 18th century. We should have a port on the Black Sea, stuff like this. But those are the right-wing lunatics. So it's it's recognized that these were not legitimately parts of Poland. And in fact, during the Cold War in the 1950s, an American scholar of legal history, published a couple of articles in which he concluded that the Soviet Union had every right to take back those territories. And that's pretty remarkable because this was at the depths of the Cold War, the mid-1950s, and yet an American scholar pointed that out. So that's the story of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which, of course, is too valuable for the anti-communists to drop because, it appears to be, or they can make it appear to be, some sort of concerted action by Hitler and Stalin, by Nazi Germany, the Communist Soviet Union. It helps them equate communism, Nazism, Hitler with Stalin, and so forth.
Not to pivot too hard to a completely new question, but
sure.
It's also alleged, not just in terms of the actions of the Soviet state, but persons that fell out of favor after the death of Stalin under Khrushchev, right? People like Lavrenti Beria, who now are known for, in the West, having committed these egregious crimes of person, right, within their capacity as an individual. What do you think about the veracity of these various claims made about Beria that he was?
Well, I've never written a book about Beria, but people keep asking about Beria. Beria is slandered even more than Stalin. He's the most slandered major figure in Soviet history, let's say, among the communist leaders. And this starts when he's deposed June 26, 1950. When Stalin died on March 5th, 1953, the former members of the old Politburo, the 5 or 6 guys, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich, Beria, Voroshilov, all got together. And they did a number of things. First of all, they divided up the government posts amongst themselves. To some extent, that had already been done, but they gave Beria the joint ministries of State Security and Internal Affairs. So that's like the MVD and the MGB. The former NKVD had become the MG, and the former NKGB, that is the State Security, had become the NGB. So this is the group, and it included Khrushchev. It gave Beria this extremely powerful post to head both of these organizations. So, you could interpret that in various ways, but certainly they would have done that if they didn't trust him in some sense. And yet in a couple of months, they not only got rid of him, probably killed him, although they say they didn't kill him, but they probably killed him there on June 26th because he was never seen again. But they called a Central Committee meeting, July, like right away. And the whole Central Committee meeting, whose proceedings have been published, was devoted to simply attacking in the most personal, vile, insulting ways Beria. Lots of people did it. Beria wasn't called forth to meet any of these accusations, and then that was the whole Central Committee meeting. So that was one mystery, if you like. And they accused him of all kinds of things which can't possibly. And there has never really been any evidence that any of them are true. But even before that, the fact that these 5 or 6 or 7 individuals, I forget the exact number, got together around Stalin's deathbed and divided up these positions was an abrogation, an ignoring of the party decisions that had been made in October 1952 at the 19th Party Congress. The 19th Party Congress had done away with the Politburo and instituted a much larger group called the Presidium that had over 30 members. And as far as we know, this group that met around Stalin's deathbed, divided up these posts among themselves, never called that Presidium again. And also in other ways, the decisions made at the October 1952 19th Party Congress of the Soviet were simply ignored. All right. They were just not spoken of. Within a few months, nobody talked about it anymore. They never appeared in the press anymore. The 19th Party Congress of October 1952 was basically organized around Stalin's last work, which is called Economic Problems of Socialism in the Soviet Union. It's a pretty well-known work. And that was like the theme of the whole 19th Party Congress. Within a couple of months of Stalin's death, you couldn't find that book in the Soviet Union anyway. Nobody ever talked about it. So So it was like you might even call it a coup d'état by these people. They just ignored the 19th Party Congress. So something serious and significant was going on here. And I mentioned this a little bit in an old article in 2005 of Stalin and the struggle for democracy. But that's a very significant issue. And of course, they accused Beria of all kinds of terrible crimes. And if he'd been guilty of these crimes, why the hell did they appoint him to this very powerful post just 3 months earlier? Beria also evidently instituted a number of reforms, which I also write about. That's widely recognized. So precisely why Beria was removed from office and killed and accused of large number of crimes and all kinds of moral turpitude has never been clear. Has never been. In the 1990s, right around the year 2000, let's say, there were a whole bunch of books published about Beria. I tried to read them all in Russian. They're very interesting, but they all basically are trying to answer this question: what the hell was going on? Why was Beria treated this way? And by the way, it wasn't just Beria. His family was hounded. His son had earned a PhD, and the PhD was taken away from him. He had to go back to college after some years and earn another PhD. I mean, it was just horrendous what they did. This is Khrushchev, what they did to Beria's family. Horrendous. So, there's certainly something worth looking into. And as I say, there's good evidence that Beria was not tried and convicted in December 1953, but in fact killed in June 1950. And that occasioned the creation of a large number of phony documents. I mean, there are interrogations of Beria and statements by Beria made in July and August 1953. If he was killed in June, of course he couldn't have. So there's a real cover-up. And by the way, how many states does this kind of thing occur in? Nothing like this ever happened under Stalin. Nothing has ever been that. So that's the story with Beria. It's really a terrible story. And it's easy in hindsight to link that up with Khrushchev's secret speech, the attacks on Stalin, and Khrushchev's introduction of more market mechanisms, which just became stronger and stronger over the years and ultimately led to the abolition of socialism.
See, I know we didn't plan for this, so feel free to, if you've got to be somewhere, fine. But what do you think about taking some questions from the super chats from the audience? A few of them. Do you have time for that, or?
I have some time. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So let me see if we've got any here briefly. Thank you, Lumpia.
This is great. Clapping.
Appreciate you.
Clapping.
Continue here.
Based.
Thank you, Townless. Well, it appears if you guys want to send in questions, we can take a few questions from the audience.
Sure. You also have this list of questions you sent me, but I guess we've covered most of these points. Soviet history during the Stalin period, and of course the immediately post-Stalin period immediately after his death, is really fascinating. Right now, my colleague Vladimir Bobrov in Moscow and I are working on the question of the death of Solomon Mikhailov. Do you know who he was? He was a well-known actor and director in the Jewish theater. It was the Yiddish language theater in the Soviet Union. He was given the Stalin Prize in 1946, and then he was killed. His body and the body of a friend of his were found on a street in Minsk on January 13th, 1948, and it appeared that he was killed by a hit-and-run driver. But the stories began to circulate that he had been killed by the Soviet state. And then the rumor mill started, and the story now has evolved to the point that claims that Stalin had him murdered, although no motive at all has been given. And this is another one of those cases. We're investigating this now. This is another one of those cases where fraudulent documents have been forged to make them look like old documents to support the story. Stalin had Solomon Mikhailov killed. And it's very clear that this is fraudulent charges and these documents are fake. But, nobody has said that because in the field of Soviet history, in the mainstream field of Soviet history. Stalin is a bad guy, and you have to say he's a bad guy, and you can't say anything else. So if Stalin is accused of a crime, it's considered bad form. It's considered really illegitimate to say that he didn't commit that crime. That's what I call the anti-Stalin paradigm. I use that phrase, which I invented some years ago. The anti-Stalin paradigm basically says that you have to affirm, if you're going to be a historian in the field of Soviet studies, at least an academic, mainstream, or respected
How many historians do you think have even reviewed the primary documents you have over your career?
A very bad guy and committed all kinds of terrible. And therefore, if he's been accused of a crime, you really shouldn't say that he didn't do it, regardless of the evidence. You just have to move on. And that's what rules the field of Soviet history. And that's why there's so many of these stories are believed, because people believe the legitimated experts in the field. Yes, please, go ahead.
We have a question from Diogenes. Thank you so much, Diogenes. How many historians do you think have reviewed the primary documents that you have in your career?
Well, historians in general like to work from primary documents. What doesn't happen is historians, or rarely happens, is that historians pick an alleged crime by Stalin and investigate that. Okay? In other words, historians write about all kinds of things. But when you pick something like, when you do something like I'm describing, you pick an alleged crime by Stalin, and that's what I've been doing for the last many years, well over 20 years now. You're really being sort of like a detective, okay? So you're trying to solve the crime. I mean, maybe Stalin did it, in which case you look at the evidence and you conclude that he did it. But in every case that I've examined, you look at the evidence and then conclude that Stalin didn't do it. So most historians do not function that way. That is, they don't go out to solve a mystery. For most historians of the Soviet period, the mysteries have been solved. Stalin killed all these people, et cetera, et cetera. They don't really say, why did he do it? They don't really say, well, he was a paranoid, he was crazy, or he was power hungry and wanted to kill anybody he thought might threaten his power, or something along those lines. Really juvenile stuff, but this is what passes for thought among historians of the Soviet Union, I'm afraid. And most historians, therefore, don't get into that. They study some very specific empirical question, what were the economics of the certain region, the country between a certain time, this kind of stuff, things that are not very not really controversial at all. And they put it inside in the context when they write up their books. If they do write a book about it, they put it in this anti-Stalin context. That's the framework in which they put their empirical research, and that's what you're expected to do. But very few historians, I can't think of any right off the top of my head, have done what I did. Well, there are a couple. There are people who research the Katyn massacre, and what they've done is just distort the evidence. Pretty secure in the knowledge that the people who read their books are not going to go out and look at the evidence for themselves. I mean, that's what I do. But so it does happen that people take on some of these very important issues and try to say, and then basically lie about it. But for the most part, most historians don't. So they use the primary sources available to write about much safer topics. And that's the way to make a career, okay, in history. You don't pick big controversial issues and take a controversial stand. You do some primary research about some issue that's not very controversial, and you get it published in a way, not the sort of thing that people like you and I are interested in.
I see. And Solerso, thank you so much for the donation. He's asking, do you plan on writing a book about the Gorbachev era ever?
I haven't gotten there yet, but the Gorbachev era, I touch on it in lots of places. Gorbachev sponsored an attack on Stalin that outdid Khrushchev. Gorbachev's men. Of course, Gorbachev, he's a politician, he's a bureaucrat. He didn't do the research, but he directed it in some sense. Gorbachev, and of course Khrushchev didn't do research either. Gorbachev was convinced clearly by the Khrushchev era publications, which we now know were lies. We know them because I've researched them. But he didn't know they were lies. He believed it. If you were going to make a career in the Communist Party, you had to be a Khrushchevite, of course. So he's a Khrushchevite. He accepted all this stuff. And he sponsored historians, use the term loosely. Lots of writers, and military people, and historians to write lots of books and articles slamming Stalin, just like Khrushchev had done. And Gorbachev was doing this for a few years longer. He also had all kinds of people rehabilitated, had not been previously rehabilitated. And my colleague Vladimir and I have researched some of this. And it's very clear that I wouldn't say that Gorbachev was lying. Gorbachev lied, but Gorbachev really didn't do all of this. He set people to work doing it, and they lied, they falsified, they fabricated. You mentioned the story of Stalin wrongly executing German communists. I believe that was things you mentioned. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in the British journal Historical Materialism, around a year ago, 9 months ago, something like that, an article was published by a guy who turns out to, I believe, a Dutch social democrat, repeating this story that, Stalin was terrible and deported all these German communists, who had trusted him, who had fled Nazism to the Soviet Union, deported them to Hitler. And he himself really didn't know anything, but the people that he quoted some German scholars, and he quoted Margareta Buber-Neumann, who's also a German, of course, who claimed that this had happened. And those people quoted some materials produced during Gorbachev's time. Anyway, I wrote a response. I wrote a whole article responding to this because I knew it was false, but I had never really studied it as such. And I wrote this article responding to this article in Historical Materialism. Now, Historical Materialism is a journal that purports to be Marxist, of course. It's published in England, but it's Trotskyist. And so I really didn't think they'd publish my article replying to the disproving these charges, and they didn't. They sent me an So I put it on my webpage, and a few left-wing journals online picked it up. It's been republished, so it's on my website. I could do more about it, but here's the story. Nobody has really taken the trouble to research this question. The German communists who were deported to Germany after the Molotov-Ribbentrop, as far as I can tell, first of all, were all people who had been convicted of serious crimes in the Soviet Union. So they were no longer communists. Once you're convicted of a serious crime, you expel this party. The second thing is, in the very few cases where we have any evidence about these people, and I put that in my article, which is on my webpage, anybody download it, it seems like all the evidence we have was that they were in fact guilty. But nobody has done what really needs to be done, which is to go to Russia and request the investigative files of these men. They were mostly. That can be done. They have all been rehabilitated under Gorbachev. So those files are, at least in theory, available. And I'm sure that many or most or perhaps even all of them really are available. Now, you'd have to go to Russia, you'd have to get a hotel room, and you'd have to spend some time and some effort doing this. But nobody's done that. So the fact is that nobody's really interested in these people. I mean, that's the sad fact. Nobody really cares about them. If they cared about them, they'd have gone there and done this research. But I don't think they do care about them. I think that the story that Stalin deported German communists to Hitler is such a great anti-Stalin and great anti-communist story that, why spoil it? Why look too deep? What you might find out is that he didn't do this. What you might find out is that these people who were deported were in fact guilty of whatever it was they were charged with. And that would ruin the story. So it's much better to just say, well, they were all innocent communists who were idealistically, went to the Soviet Union, and the vicious Stalin gave them to Hitler. Now, there's one more thing about this. Back in 2012, I believe, there was an article published. I mean, maybe he's published a book since then, but at least it was an article published by a German social democrat, an anti-communist guy, who took the statement by Margareta Buber-Neumann, that's where all this story of deported German communists originates, from her book, and did some research. He didn't do the research in the Soviet Union to see if these people were guilty or not. Of course, he doesn't read Russian, or he didn't research them from that end. He researched them from the German end. What happened to these people after they arrived in Germany, once they were deported? Okay? He didn't question that they were all guilty, that Stalin was a bad guy, whatever. He didn't question that. But what happened to these people? And what he found is that they were mostly not persecuted by Hitler at all. Some of them were left completely. One or two of them ended up in jail. According to him, most of them didn't. And that there's no evidence that Stalin did this in order to curry favor with Hitler, which is what Margareta Bouvernoyen said. She said this was Stalin's gift to Hitler. But this anti-communist German social democrat says no. So I put that article online, and I have a link to it in my book, the book called Stalin Waiting for the Truth, in which I criticize Stephen Kotkin's volume called Stalin Waiting for Hitler. I just thought it was worthwhile putting that volume. Of course, Stephen Kotkin, his book, repeats this story of Stalin deporting all the poor German communists to Hitler. The article that I am referring to was published in 2012. Stephen Kotkin could certainly have known about it. He could have used it. He did know about it. But if he knew about it, he suppressed it. Or maybe he just didn't want to look. Again, I tend to think that's probably what happened. Why look too closely into these alleged crimes of Stalin? Because you might find that they're not true. And that's not the job of anti-communist researchers, to find out that allegations against Stalin are true. Their job is to support those allegations. Okay. I think it's important that we realize, and perhaps I should have said it earlier in this talk, that the field of Soviet history in the West has always been the handmaiden of politics. That is, it's always been basically had the job of finding dirt, any kind of negative stuff about Stalin and the Soviet Union in order to support political anti-communism. So it's not an innocent field. If there's any parallel at all, it would be something like historians who are supporters of the old Confederacy of the South in the Civil War, going off to write the histories of the Civil War. That certainly happened. And imagine they have a tremendous bias when they do that, and they don't come to conclusions that make the Confederacy look bad. Okay, so that's the kind of thing you have in Soviet history. I'm not saying there aren't any honest historians, but they tend to keep their heads down and not buck the trend. The few who have suffered, their careers have suffered.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Jay, and thank you so much, MIG. They have pretty similar questions. Jay's asking, what do you think about their allegations regarding collectivization? And MIG is asking, where did the notion that the so-called Holodomor or the Ukrainian famine was a deliberate attempt at genocide?
Yes. Okay. So, more briefly, the key name here is Mark Tauger, Tauger. He's a professor of history at West Virginia University. He has spent his life researching Russian and Soviet agriculture, including the famines. He's published a lot of very, very important, extremely well-researched works. And I have met him and talked to him extensively. He is not a leftist of any kind. He is extremely objective. He's not a pro-Stalin person, whatever that might mean to you. His work is extremely good. He's the best, I think, in the world. And I have summarized his works in the first two chapters of my book, Blood Lies, and in the first chapter of my book, Stalin Waiting for the Truth. So if you want to get a bibliography of his stuff, sort of a summary discussion of his work, I refer you to those two works. The first two chapters in Blood Lies and the first chapter in Stalin. The Holodomor, the term is actually invented in the early 50s. And it comes from the Ukrainian nationalists who sided with the Nazis. After the late 1920s, the Ukrainian nationalist movement turned towards the fascists. They saw that the fascists were the nationalists who were going to be the most successful in Germany and Italy, and they turned to their organizations became fascist. And the Ukrainian nationalists entered the Soviet Union as allies with the German, secondary allies, of course, junior allies with the German forces in 1991. They committed lots and lots of atrocities. They committed genocide against Poles in Ukraine, 43, 94. Some of them, quite a few of them, stayed behind after the end of World War II and carried on a very vicious terrorist war in Ukraine against Soviet forces, killed lots of civilians, Soviet soldiers. But many more of them fled to the West, where they were pampered and coddled and promoted by the Germans, Canadians, especially the Canadians, and also by the United States CIA. So you had real big-time war criminals, German, Ukrainian nationalist war criminals living at government expense, some of them, at least the top ones, at government expense, and all admitted to the countries in at least Germany, Canada, and the United States. Apparently some in Australia as well. So around the early 50s, one of them invented this term, the Holodomor, and it's meant to sound like Holocaust. Okay, there's that first two syllables, Holocaust, Holodomor, even though the words don't mean the same thing. They sound similar because the Ukrainian nationalist, fascist Ukrainian nationalist, anti-communist line was, hey, the Soviets killed 10 million Ukrainians or 6 or 7 million Ukrainians, but nobody's paying attention to that. They're only paying attention to the 6 million Jews who were killed. One of these groups of Ukrainian fascist immigrants in Australia in the 1980s actually published a book called Why is One Holocaust Worth More Than Another? By which they meant, the Jews have convinced everybody that Germany should feel bad about the Holocaust, should feel guilty, but nobody is making the Soviets feel guilty that they committed a Holocaust against the Ukrainians. Well, that's where the term originates. And after 1991, when Ukraine becomes a separate country, these people, these war criminals and their younger cohorts by this time, who had fought on the side of the Nazis and who had celebrated their Nazi collaborators as heroes, nationalist heroes, they flooded back into Ukraine, and they came to dominate in educational and cultural and historical fields. So that in Ukraine, monuments to these Nazi mass murderers start being built, streets start being named after them, parks start being, dedicated in their honor, the history books start being rewritten, and the myth of the Holodomor becomes required teaching in Ukraine. This becomes a fact. Now, there's no evidence for it. I read those couple of chapters in my book, Blood Lies, and the one chapter in Stalin Waiting for the Truth, or you go off and read Mark Tauger's research, which is largely available online. It may all be available online. If you Google Mark Tauger, you'll find it. And I have references in my book. There has never been any evidence that this Holodomor happened. There certainly was a famine, but it wasn't confined to Ukraine. It was all over important parts of the Soviet Union. Apparently, it was most severe in Kazakhstan, where there weren't any Ukrainians. But the Ukrainian nationalists are not concerned about evidence. So they have a journal called Journal of Holodomor Studies. There are monuments all over Ukraine. There's a big monument on the land, on the property of the Ukrainian embassy to the United States. They have a monument to the Holodomor. And it's they would like the Holodomor to become as generally accepted as a Soviet crime as the Katyn massacre is already generally accepted as a Soviet. The difference is that there is this evidence that the of the Katyn massacre. There's the German report that the Nazis put out, and then there are these falsified documents that given by Gorbachev to Yeltsin, and that Yeltsin then passed on to the rest of the world. But in the case of the Holodomor, there's no evidence whatsoever. There's a guy named Kulchitsky, who was a Ukrainian historian this period, in this time period, who lived there during Soviet times. He's still alive, as far as I know. Who was very anti-communist and so forth. And in the early 1990s, he wrote a series of articles, including some in English, where he admits that until these Ukrainian nationalists flooded back into the country, he didn't even know there had been a Holodomor. And he was living there all the time, and he was writing history. But he says now he accepts that there was a Holodomor and the Soviets were trying to kill all the Ukrainians and so on. So what's happened is the Ukrainian nationalists have made an end run around the scholarly community. Even the anti-communist scholarly community doesn't accept. Stephen Kotkin doesn't accept it. Really, none of them accept. None of the anti-communist Soviet scholars accept it. But they don't really. That's too bad. I guess the Ukrainian nationalists must feel that they're too bad. But they are interested in aiming at a wider public. They're interested in getting into the movies, getting into the magazines, getting into the newspapers, getting into the school system, stuff like this. And they can do that by ignoring the fact that the scholars don't So that's the story about the Holodomor. That's how it was created. There's a reasonably good book written about the history of this concept. Unfortunately, it's in Ukrainian, so it isn't really accessible to.
Yeah, I mean, it's really all over the media, even though the scholars say disagree. But we have a question from Voidburn, and he's asking, how did Stalin reconcile Georgian national identity with Russo-Soviet patriotism? Thank you, Voidburn, for that.
Russo-Soviet what?
With Russo-Soviet patriotism.
Well, the Soviets had this line. I don't know anything specific about Georgia during this period of time. If you really wanted to study Georgian, you have to learn the Georgian language, which is no mean feat.
I see. Yeah.
Stalin was Georgian by nationality. He, of course, being a communist, was an internationalist ideologically. But in terms of the Soviet Union, of course, the dominant nationality is Russian. So Russian became the language of wider communication. Everybody studied Russian in all Soviet schools, right? If you lived in one of the republics or even autonomous areas which were set aside for certain nationalities, you went to school in the language of that nationality. If you were a Ukrainian who lived in Russia, however, you went to school in Russian. But everybody learned Russian. The theory under the Soviets was culture should be national in form and socialist in content. Now, that was their goal: nationalist in form and socialist content. And I think that it's fair to say that the Soviet Union, during the time of its existence, was the most successful multinational state in the face of the world. Maybe since the Roman Empire. I mean, the Roman Empire was a multinational state. Everybody, the upper classes all learned Latin, and there were emperors from all kinds of other parts of the Roman Empire. I mean, the Roman Empire wasn't it was a lot of bad things, perhaps, but the Roman Empire was not racist. And the Soviet Union was very much like that. There's a book which has its problems. I'm not recommending it as such. There's a book, though, that was published about 20 years ago called I'll think it's about multinationalism, the Soviet Union, and recognizing that it was basically very successful. The problem becomes, it seems to me, is that when you're no longer building socialism, when you're no longer aiming towards communism, who needs international? Okay, if you're no longer really building international proletarian consciousness and have your eye on that ideal of world communism, then nationalism starts to take over, starts to predominate. And that's certainly what happened in the last decades of the Soviet Union. I'm not saying that nationalism was ever squelched, was ever completely conquered. There were always probably anti-communist nationalist groups clandestinely organizing in various places, no doubt. But once you're not building proletarian international, I think nationalism starts to come to the fore. And it's because of nationalism. Nationalism was the form in which the disintegration of the Soviet Union place. By the way, under Stalin, and of course later too, all of the republics, within the Soviet Union, had their own communist parties, except Russia. Russia did not have its own communist party. And that would be that would be an interesting thing to look into, because clearly that had something to do with not wanting the Russian Communist Party to be a sort of national communist party. This Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the unifying force, And there's some sort of contradiction between having national communist parties and also the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I'm not saying that they ever worked out these nationalist problems completely. I know clearly they didn't, because when the Soviet Union fell apart, you had all this resurgence of nationalism. By the way, that book is called The Affirmative Action Empire. Okay, not a bad book. It's by a guy named Terry Mark. He makes some, he's an anti-communist, of course. In that field, you have to be, but he makes some pretty acute remarks, and that's his view of the Soviet Union. They were really trying very hard to be affirmative action, but there's a contradiction there, right? On the one hand, affirmative action. On the other hand, you call it an empire. An empire suggests domination of one group over others. So, but I think the Soviet Union was the most successful multinational country in the world in its day, certainly while all of the nationalities, the rest of Europe and all of the other continents are fighting each other to the death. You had a great deal of national harm with it. So,
Nuke Nukem, thank you. And he's asking, did Stalin die of natural causes, or do you think there was a possibility of foul play?
Yeah, people talk about that a lot. People ask me about that sometimes. There are a lot of theories. I don't think it's a particularly fruitful way to approach the subject politically. I think the most you could say, according to the evidence that I haven't done any profound research on this, is that it seems that Stalin suffered some sort of stroke, perhaps as early as the 1st of March, 1950. And nobody really checked on him, as far as we know, for quite a while. So medical care wasn't gotten for him very promptly. I'm not sure why that might have been. Perhaps he told his guard not to bother him. He kept very strange hours. Stalin worked at night and slept in the daytime. It's this kind of thing. It's not like he had regular hours. But also, Stalin was not in good physical shape. Stalin worked less and less and less after World War II. By 1950 or 51, he was only rarely attending Politburo meetings. I allude to that in my book, Khrushchev Lied. We know that a rubber stamp with Stalin's signature was created so that his signature, because he was the head of state, so that his signature could be affixed to documents in his absence by the officials who met, by the Politburo at least, or by the Council of Ministers, which is the government body. The journal of the times that he visited, that he was in his office and who he saw, who came to see him, that journal has been published. It's clear that he was less and less and less active. There are some reports about his speech to the 19th Party Congress in October 1952. That's only 5 months before he died, right? Less than 5 months before he died. And evidently one of the things he said in his speech on October 16th, 1952 is, "I'm old, I can't read documents anymore. I would like to resign." And there was this great outcry, no, you can't resign. And as he had done, by the way, Stalin had offered to resign 5 or 6 times before that. And each time he acquiesced to the party leaders saying he mustn't do that. But he was clearly in bad physical shape. I don't think it's necessary to think that he was put to death, murdered anyway. Perhaps he did not get swift and adequate medical care when he had a stroke. But he did have that stroke, and who's to say he would have recovered regardless of whatever care he received. So no, I would advise you not to waste your time speculating on that. By the way, one of the things the rumors that was spread during Khrushchev's time, Beria had Stalin. I don't see that.
Yeah, I recall from Khrushchev's memoirs, he said something like, as soon as Stalin died, Beria was spitting on him, something like that. So he clearly was trying.
Yes, Khrushchev's memoirs. Khrushchev, as I point out in that book, Khrushchev Lied. The fact that Khrushchev said something happened is not evidence that it happened.
Yeah.
Contradicted himself all over the place. He said different things to different people at different times. He even said a couple of times, and Amy Knight in her book on Beria mentions that Khrushchev even let fall a couple of times that they'd killed Beria, although then he retracted it. But you can't rely on what Khrushchev said. Of course, the West loves to rely on what Khrushchev said because it feeds into the anti-Stalin paradigm. Right. Khrushchev hated Stalin, so he blamed Stalin for lots and lots of stuff in his memoirs.
Yeah,
so they treated with more. They treated it as more accurate than they.
Yes. Speaking of Khrushchev, we have a question from Lily Goldplank. Thank you. She wants to know. There was an anti-party group that was supposedly trying to outmaneuver Khrushchev. What do you think was the reason for their failure? The anti-party group, so-called.
Well, there's a lot of writing about that. That's pretty well known. That's the old Stalinists. That's Molotov, Kaganovich, and Voroshilov. Voroshilov, and Dmitry Shapilov, who was not one of the top party leaders, but who decided that he would join with them. And they got enough votes to kick Khrushchev out of this position in 1957. Oh, they didn't like Khrushchev's policies. I mean, I mean, that's an interesting question. So exactly what their motivation was, but they didn't like his policy. So, and they didn't like his attacks on Stalin, which they had to know were phony. If you read the book, which is an abbreviated version of a longer Russian book. But if you read the book called Molotov Remembers, and it's in English, you can see that Molotov really did not like it. He really did. So there were strong feelings. And I'm not saying Molotov, but Molotov, everything Molotov says is correct. But certainly he hated Khrushchev, and Khrushchev hated him. So there was a lot of animosity. But they had all gone along with killing Beria or covering up Beria's murder or deposing Beria, treating Beria and his family terribly. So they did not have clean hands. However, what Khrushchev did was Khrushchev clearly was well organized. We don't know enough about this. Nobody's investigated. Maybe it's too late, but something should be done. Clearly, there was some sort of organization among the party first secretaries, that is, the leaders of the party all over major cities, provinces, oblasts, and so forth, republics, and party leaders, and they were all in the Central Committee. There must have been some sort of communication among them, some sort of contact, because Khrushchev was able to call these people up. And then he called up Marshal Zhukov. Marshal Zhukov got the Air Force. Zhukov wasn't an Air Force man, but he had contacts. And fly these party first secretaries to Moscow for the meeting, so that the anti-party, so-called anti-party group, this is what Khrushchev called them, right? Really, the pro-Stalin or the anti-Khrushchev, so that those people could be outvoted, and that's what happened. They were all in. And by the way, then there was a Central Committee, castigating those people, and those proceedings have been published too. That was in February 1997. So the transcript of that Central Committee is published too. I don't know if it's in English. It may be in English somewhere. It's in Russian. That's the story with that.
Devin Batchelor, thank you so much. And he wants to know, what is this whole thing about the doctor's plot? Can you comment a little on that?
Yeah, that's post-war stuff. I'm just getting into that. Okay, well, but I discussed this I have a book called Blood Lies. I've referred to it before. It's a critique of this book by Timothy Snyder, who's this full professor at Yale, who's all over the news media these days. But anyway, but Snyder's a horrible liar. And he wrote a book called Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, back in 2010. And I wrote a book pointing out that everything he says about the Soviet Union and Stalin in that book is a provable lie. So I recommend that book. And in the last chapter, or the second to last chapter, I forget which one, I have a little section on the doctor's plot. So you should read that. There certainly was a conspiracy of doctors, but that was in 1948 when Andrei Zhdanov died. There may have been something going on in 1945 when Alexander Shcherbakov, who was another major party leader, died. It seems like they were given poor medical treatment, perhaps deliberately, although that was never proven. But they admitted, in the case of Zhdanov, the doctors who mistreated him admitted that they had mistreated him, but they said that they had done it by mistake. So then there's the arrest of a bunch of doctors in 1951 and 52, and their imprisonment, interrogation. I have not thoroughly investigated that. One of the first things Beria did after Stalin's death was to have them all released, and he blamed it all on one of the higher level members of the MGB, the state security, a guy named Ryumin. He said that Ryumin was responsible. Ryumin had done this. He also blamed it to some extent on Natyev, who had been the head of the MVD before Beria. But in any case, Beria had them released. Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's daughter, who's wrote several books of memoirs, not necessarily all that reliable because it was many years later. But somewhere in there, she says that the maid in her father's house, at Stalin's house, told her, Svetlana, that Stalin had said to the maid that he didn't believe those charges against him. He didn't believe. So, I don't know, why would Svetlana write that if the maid hadn't told her that? She was a pretty naive person, it seems, judging those documents. It seems like Stalin didn't have much to do with it. One more. Again, I haven't made a special study of this, but you run across this. The editorials in Pravda the editorials in the newspaper, the articles in the newspapers criticizing and attacking the doctors for plotting to harm Soviet leaders stopped on March the 1st. And the Medvedev brothers, Zhorez and Roy Medvedev, who had become anti-Stalin intellectuals and have written a bunch of books about this period, say in one of those books, or they hypothesize in one of those books, that the only person powerful enough to stop those editorials, on a dime, sort of like give the order, no more of this, was Stalin. So it appeared to them, and they were very anti-Stalin people, it appears to them that Stalin probably gave the order, he was the head of state, to the newspapers to stop publishing these articles about the doctors. But they were arrested. They may have been mistreated. I haven't studied that. They were accused of plotting against the Soviet leaders. That happened. But Beria blamed Ryumin, and Ryumin was eventually tried and executed. I don't know what the charges against him were because I haven't looked into it. But that's the story. That's as much as I know about the doctor's plot. But when it comes to Sherbakov's death in 1945 and Andrei Zhdanov's death in 1948, that's a different story. Alexander Sherbakov had a heart attack. And May the 9th, which was Victory Day, he asked his doctors if he could get out of bed and go into the city, to Moscow, to be present when the Soviet people were celebrating the victory of Nazis. And according to his biographer, the doctors did not stop him. They did not object. And of course, he did that. He felt weak. He was driven back to his house and he died. It's perfectly well known that if you have a heart attack, absolute bed rest is imperative, okay? You can't be moving around. The same thing happened with Zhdanov. He was told by his doctors that it's okay for him to go out and walk around the garden, so to speak. And he had another heart attack, a third heart attack, died. The doctors strongly suspected, I should say the MVD strongly suspected he had done this deliberately. Now, it's a little bit longer story, which I won't go into, but after they were cleared, they admitted that they had mistreated him. They had given him poor treatment. But they said it wasn't a conspiracy, it was a mistake. And they weren't punished for it. I mean, if it had been the United States, right, they'd have been sued, right? The family would have sued them. And who knows what would have happened. Maybe they'd have lost their medical licenses, but none of that happened. But they said, I mean, I have it in my book. They had agreed that they had mistreated him. They just said it wasn't with malice or forethought. They weren't trying to kill off the Soviet leader. But who knows? Who knows?
Yeah. It's interesting. Thank you, Black Lenin. He wants to know that allegedly there's these stains of blood on Tukhachevsky's confession paper. Can you comment on?
Run right out and buy our book. We have a book called Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy, which came out in 2020. Go get that book and you'll read all about Tukhachevsky, and you'll read all about, there's a whole chapter on the alleged bloodstain.
Oh, okay? Wow. Where can
I don't want to give it away.
Where can people
go get the book. If you don't want to buy the book, then steal it or order it for your local library and borrow it, whatever. But there's a whole chapter on that. There's a whole chapter on that. There's more here than appears to be. Okay.
Where can people find that book to
Okay,
purchase?
well, you can go to Amazon.com, of course.
Okay.
You can write me. You can go to the publisher's webpage, Erythros Press. That's www.erythros.com.
And another one I recommend to you guys is obviously Khrushchev Lied, right? That's
you can go to Erythros Press for all except 2 of my books. And those 2 have been published, or maybe 4. But anyway, those have been published by Red Star Publishers.
Excellent.
But you can buy them all on Amazon. I mean, I don't.
That's good. Yeah.
Buy the book. Buy it from my publisher, or buy it from me.
Yeah, I was just asking because Amazon, sometimes they censor.
No, they don't censor this. But Amazon. I'm just talking from my publisher's viewpoint. He's a small left-wing publisher. Amazon takes $6 every time you sell a book through Amazon. They take $6, and if you buy it from the publisher, Erythros Press and Media LLC, www.erythros.com, then my publisher gets the $6, and he's a small publisher. He could use. But I got a whole chapter on that.
Yeah, that's good to know. And then Lysenko Medical School with the 5. Thank you for the 5. He's asking, how do I respond to anti-communist Armenian Armenians who blame Stalin for giving Armenian territory to Azerbaijan?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know anything about that. I really don't know. I mean, the basic problem here is the Armenians and the Azerbaijan. You asked about the Georgians before. The Armenians and the Azerbaijanis have been the nationalists.
Yeah,
have been at each other's throats for a very long time. The same thing is true with Georgia. Georgia was always a problem. I mean, before the Russian Revolution, the Caucasus is this area that has a lot of very small national groups. Georgians are by far the largest. So that within that limited area of the Caucasus, the Georgians have always been trying to, dominate the other national groups, which are much smaller. And even after the end of the Soviet Union, the state of Georgia, which includes a lot of these little national groups, right? I mean, they can't all have separate countries. They're just too damn small. The state of Georgia wanted to make Georgian, the national language of Georgia. Okay. Now, of course, under the Soviet Union, it was Russia, right? Everybody spoke Russian. You spoke your own little language, whatever the hell it was, small Caucasian language that was spoken by very few people. And then you spoke Russian. So you didn't have to learn Georgian. Everybody spoke in Russian. So Georgian nationalists wanted all of these people to study Georgian. Well, they didn't want to study Georgian. They already knew Russian. And if they wanted to study a foreign language, it's probably English, right? I mean, why do we want to learn Georgian, which is a horrendously difficult language, like all of those languages, apparently. So there's been a problem with Georgian nationalism for a very long time. And there was a problem during the Soviet period with Georgian nationalism. My guess is there was a problem with Azerbaijani and or they say Azeri and Armenian nationalism too. That's my guess, but I have not done any great study. I mean, let's remember the whole idea here is internationalism, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we want to promote internationalism, not national rivalry. Okay, but any more than that, I don't know.
So I think this is the last one.
Sure.
And it's from Atari. Thank you, Atari. I think this is probably also going to be found in that book you recommended, but they're asking, to what degree did the internal opposition, Trotsky, Zinoviev, collaborate with the external forces? And are there any ulterior motives for the opposition other than ideology?
Well, I have a book. I have 4 books on Trotsky. Okay, you can look them up. They're all on Amazon. They're all published by Erythros.com. They're all mentioned on my homepage, which anybody can find by typing my name into Google. And I go into the evidence that we have. Also, this book on the Tukhachevsky affair, which I call Trotsky and the Military, or we call. I have some co-authors there. Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy. There's a lot about Trotsky there. But I also have a book called The Moscow Trials as Evidence. So the Moscow Trials as Evidence goes into the evidence that, ask the question, what evidence do we have about the Moscow trials, other than the transcripts in the Moscow trials themselves? It's universally taken for granted that all these people were framed and were innocent, but there has never been any evidence that they were innocent. And it turns out, if you look at my book, The Moscow Trials as Evidence, that there's lots of evidence that they were guilty, even non-Soviet evidence, okay? Evidence from outside the Soviet Union. They can't possibly have been framed, but there's so much evidence now from the former Soviet archives that's been published where suspects name others, they describe the conspiracies and so forth and so on. And this can be, in many cases, not at all, can be corroborated by other Soviet evidence and even by non-Soviet evidence, that there simply can't be any doubt that these people and so the claim that they were all innocent, of course, this comes from Khrushchev, the Khrushchev period, and then later on, those who were not declared innocent in the Khrushchev period, and many were proclaimed innocent in the Gorbachev. It's important to recognize that even Western anti-communist scholars have recognized that rehabilitation in the Soviet Union did not mean you were innocent. It just meant that it was considered politically useful for some reason or other to declare a person rehabilitated. And so all of these people were rehabilitated, but it didn't mean that they were innocent. And in fact, we know that all of the evidence we have indicates that they were not. So if you take a look at that book of Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy, you'll see lots of stuff about Trotsky, but there's also stuff about some of the other conspirators. And then my book, The Moscow Trials as Evidence, and my other 3 books on Trotsky give lots and lots and lots of evidence from former Soviet lives. These people were all guilty. In fact, they were guilty. They committed crimes that they did not even admit to. And let me just say my one last point about this. One of the best known, most famous of the defendants was a guy named Nikolai Bukharin. He was one of the major defendants in the 1938 Moscow trial. Now, Bukharin, if you ever read the transcript, now how many people read the transcript? It's an 800-page long transcript. I guess as very few people read it. I mean, I studied it. I think almost nobody does that. They have opinions about the Moscow trials. They don't study the transcripts. And that's just where to begin, of course. Bukharin spent by far most, 75% of his time on the witness stand in that trial, denying accusations that the prosecutor, Andrei Vyshinsky, made against him, denying crimes that Vyshinsky was accusing him of. That was most of his testimony. Now, in the other part of his testimony, Bukharin did admit to very serious crime. He did not say, "Oh, I'm completely innocent." He said, "No, I'm guilty of some very serious crimes, but I'm not guilty of that particular crime or that particular or that." And he was very vehement. Now, listen, if there had been any kind of threats against his family, "Oh, you better confess or we'll harm your family," or any kinds of threats of torture, "If you don't confess, we're going to torture you," why would he have done that? In 1992, the Bukharin's the appeals of their death sentences by Bukharin and a number of the other defendants who were convicted in the 3 Moscow trials, those were published. Bukharin actually wrote 2 appeals where he tries to talk the judges into letting him live, and how useful he can be to the Soviet Union, et cetera, if they let him live. But he says in that appeal, this is an appeal of his death sentence. He says, "For my crimes, I should be shot 10 times over." Well, you put that together with all the other evidence we have, how can you say that this guy was innocent? I don't think he was innocent. We know that he did not confess everything. There's this famous letter that he wrote to Stalin, December the 10th, 1937, when he was still in prison before the trial. The trial was in March 1938. And this was published. This is widely circulated. He wrote this letter to Stalin. And what he says in this letter to Stalin, now he'd already admitted that he was guilty, but in this letter to Stalin, he says he wasn't guilty. He's not guilty. He says, "I've come clean. I've admitted." Well, he doesn't quite say that. He says, "I've come clean. I've admitted everything." So he doesn't actually retract the confessions that he had made earlier. And we have those documents now. But, he tries to cozy up to Stalin in various ways. They had been friends. And he said, "Of course, I've always been a supporter of yours. I never would do anything. I'd never plot against you. I'd never do anything to harm you. We were so close." Well, that's what Bukharin is saying in December the 10th, 1937. In 1971, the memoirs of a man named Jules Humbert Droz, who was a member of the Comintern from Switzerland. He was a Swiss communist. He was a member of the Comintern from Switzerland back in the 1920s. He was a very close friend of Bukharin. He published these very voluminous, 800 pages or 700-page long memoirs. And he was living in Switzerland. He'd been living in Switzerland for many years. So the Soviets weren't making him write this. And he says in that book, I met Bukharin. It's not quite clear whether it was in 1927 or 28. And Bukharin said that he and his followers were planning to kill Stalin. Now, this is before collectivization, before any of that stuff starts to happen, before the 5-year plans. This is very early. And Humbert Droz says, "Well, I told Bukharin, that's bad. That's terrorism. I don't agree with that. You have to defeat him politically. Assassination is not the way to go. And this was the last time I ever spoke to Bukharin." So he says. Now, that passage from those memoirs is usually ignored. But why would Humbert Droz, who hated Stalin, why would Humbert Droz say this about Bukharin? Why would he lie about it? Why would he fabricate that? It's just a couple of paragraphs in this 700-page memoir. So I think it's true. Bukharin was a real snake. He pretended to be for Stalin. He pretended to be his friend. He would go to Stalin's for dinner and stuff like this. They would call each other by their first names. And he was plotting to kill him very early in the game, back in the 1920s. And he didn't confess that. He never confessed to that. So, was Bukharin guilty? I mean, lots of evidence that Bukharin was guilty. He was guilty of things he didn't confess. I think that there's plenty of evidence to show that. But of course, that's taboo, right? In the field of Soviet history, you can't say that. These people are all framed. You have to agree to that. That's the anti-Stalin paradigm. So that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with capitalist historians who lie about the history of the Soviet. And that's what I've been working on. I started with Khrushchev, discovered that he lied, and then I've just taken up and gradually researching all of these accusations against Stalin and finding out that to this point, I haven't found a single one of them that's true.
Yeah, wow. I know
that's why you interviewed me, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I know I said that was the last one. There is one more. It's up to you if you want to take it or not. It's from Chris Moyle. I think it's about Stephen Kotkin. He's just pretty much asking, you think he's like the new Robert Conquest in academia? And right now, who do you think takes the cake in terms of academics and lies about the Soviet Union?
Well, okay. So Stephen Kotkin's at Princeton, full professor at Princeton. He's a fellow of the Hoover Institution. Hoover Institution, of course, is the largest and best funded anti-communist research institution in the world. And he's been studying the Stalin era his whole professional life since he was a graduate. So he's got this project of writing a 3-volume biography of Stalin, of which the first 2 volumes have been published. He recently said that the next volume may be published in 2024, and that'd be the end. So volume 1 has its problems, but it has its good points. I mean, he's very anti-communist, but volume 1 of his biography of Stalin only goes up to 1929. So how much the horrible crimes that Stalin is accused of all start with the 1930s, right? Not with the 1920s. So he has some nasty things to say about Stalin, but on the whole, there's a lot of factual material there too. Not that other people don't have as well. Volume 2 is 1929 to 1941, and this is a real atrocity. I wrote a book called Stalin Waiting for the Truth, and that's a kind of making fun of or parodying the title of Kotkin's second volume, which is Stalin Waiting for Hitler, 1920. And in that book, which I recommend to you, I take every single allegation of crime or misdeed by Stalin and subject it to a look at the evidence. Look at the evidence that Kotkin cites. When he cites evidence, sometimes he doesn't bother to cite anything, but usually he cites something, and look at all of that. And then, of course, there's lots of stuff that he doesn't cite. There's lots of other evidence. And I show that Kotkin cannot come up with a single crime or misdeed that Stalin committed. Not one. Every single one that he cites is unsupported by evidence. So there we are. But of course, the book has gotten great, so I recommend my book to you. But the book has gotten rave reviews, of course, because who's going to read this thing? It's 1,100 pages. It's got 5,295 footnotes. Who's going to read the book and then turn around and check the footnotes to see and then go read the stuff in the footnotes to see if the footnotes actually support the statements that Kotkin made? Well, I did that. Not all 5,000, just the ones where he was documenting, where he pretended to document misstatements by Stalin. It's still an awful lot, okay? And of course, many, or most of these footnotes are to Russian sources. You have to be able to read Russian, you have to have access to them. I did all of that. So I can tell you, Kotkin lied. It's just an atrocious piece of work. But of course, it won prizes and made him famous because, hey, it shows what a bastard Stalin was, right? That was the whole point. And it's got 5,000 footnotes. So who's going to question this? But if you want to know what I think it proves that none of these anti-communist scholars actually has any evidence that Stalin committed any crime, because if they did, Kotkin would have snuffed it out. He would have found it, and he would have put it in that book, along with all the lies. I'm not saying he'd have left the lies out, but he would have put in 1 or 2 true statements, true accusations too, right? If he'd found any real crimes, he'd put that in there too. And by the way, that's true about Khrushchev's speech. When I discovered years ago now, did that research, and discovered that everything Khrushchev said in that speech is a lie. That implies at least this, that he wasn't able to find any real crimes that Stalin committed, or he would have included those, right? He may, we'll throw in some lies, but we'll put in the true stuff too. But he didn't do that. And Kotkin doesn't do it either. He can't find any true lies. I mean, any true crimes that Stalin committed. So it's all false, and I prove that in my book because nobody's going to believe that. Furr says Stephen Kotkin, this world famous guy, does nothing but lie. Why should you believe me? Well, you're right. You shouldn't believe me. You should go read the book and see how I show by evidence that there's nothing true. So I think that's a useful book in this negative way, sort of a backhanded way, right? I think that no one knows of any real crimes that Stalin committed because they would be in Kotkin's enormous book, and they're not there.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like we're looking at a situation in the world right now where, a lot of these academics, they have this reputation and they have this level of credibility that doesn't actually reflect the actual methodology and the scientific methodology that should back that up. And I think we're entering an era now, with Russia and China and other world powers rising. I mean, this institutional consensus, I don't think it's going to really last, at least as a universal standard anymore. I think perspectives such as yours are increasingly becoming more welcome and more cited.
Well, they're welcome. They're not really welcome in the field of Soviet history, in the academic field of history. Okay, that's pretty much buttoned down. You can't say that Stalin wasn't a monster and didn't commit all.
What about in like Russia, though?
There is a little room in Russia. Okay, there are a relatively small number of academics in Russia who do, and non-academics too. I mean, in other countries in the world, research and history is not completely controlled by academics. Yes, there certainly are, you might call, pro-Stalin writers and researchers in Russia. And don't forget, Russia, the largest political party in Russia, and set aside Vladimir Putin's party, he kind of created for himself. But if you set that aside, the largest enduring political party in Russia is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is the successor to the old CPSU. I'm not saying that their politics are particularly, but they're very large. They're very influential. There are a lot of people in it. They have a lot of seats in the Duma. It makes Russia very, very different from all of the other post-Soviet states, which, well, maybe not from Belarus, but from most of the other post-Soviet states, which are dominated by super anti-communists, like Ukraine, Poland, and so forth. So there's and of course it was the Russians who made the Russian Revolution. They made their own revolution. So there's a lot of nostalgia, well, now among mainly older people for the old Soviet Union, and a lot of sympathy for Stalin. Not that people necessarily have all of that great historical scholarship, but there's just a lot of room in Russia for people to write the truth. I know I've been contacted by people in Russia, Katyn.
Yeah, I mean,
there's been a number of books translated into Russian and published there, and it's because you can do that. Whereas my book on Katyn that was translated into Russia and actually was the second translation done and selling very well, so I'm told. My book on Katyn is translated into Polish, and it can't be sold in any Polish store. No Polish bookstore will carry it because it's against the law in Poland to promote communism. And the gentleman I know who took it around to various bookstores there said that the booksellers would be willing to carry it, except they're afraid they might be prosecuted by the Polish government because the Polish government might consider that to be promoting communist propaganda, that the Soviets didn't do it. So it can't be sold in Poland.
Yeah, but, I mean, I can only...
Very well in Russia. There's a lot of people in Russia who never believed that Stalin shot all these Poles, because why would he have done it? But that's not, of course, you'd say, well, why the hell would he have done it? The Germans were doing this all over the place. They were slaughtering masses of people. So that's consistent with their behavior. It's not consistent with the Soviet behavior. But of course, you have to go and look at the evidence, and that's what I did. And if you're interested in Katyn, go take a look at my book, The Katyn Massacres. But yeah, there's room in Russia. But outside of Russia, and of course, China, okay? One of my books has become Khrushchev Lied, was translated and published in China. One or two more books may or may not eventually be published there. We'll have to see. But outside Russia and secondarily China, no. You have to be an anti-Stalin figure. And if you're not an anti-Stalin figure, then you're marginalized, So,
well, I mean, in Stalin's own words, paraphrasing it, he said, I think this was what he said. Maybe it was a crypto quote or whatever. But, after my death, a pile of rubbish will be piled on my grave, but the winds of history will eventually clear it. And honestly, I really have such great admiration and respect for the way in which you've approached the primary sources and you've approached this question without regard for the institutional consensus and the political biases. And it's really that it seems to me that you've arrived at the conclusions you have, not because of some ideological bias or distortion of the facts, but simply because you had the courage to point out the fact that, these powerful institutional and academic forces were lying, right? So you really have my eternal gratitude for being one of the only historians in the English-speaking world, if not the only one, who's willing to actually engage this topic honestly.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your inviting me on this program, and I look forward to getting the link when you put it online. I encourage your listeners to, both those who are online now and anybody who sees it in the future, to go to my webpage. All of my articles are downloadable there. You can also get a list of my books, and to inform yourselves. And if you wish to email me with questions or comments or criticisms, please be free to do so. My email is on my page. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.